In this demo, we'll create a new ASP.NET Core project from scratch, and we will learn how to launch it. I've got Visual Studio up and running. Let's choose to create a new project. Depending on the template we choose, additional files and dependencies will be added. Some starter samples might be included, and some configuration might be filled out. We're building an API, so let's look for the API template. By the way, if you've previously watched some of my courses, you might have noticed I often like to start from an empty template to avoid references and code being included that I don't need. I've got to say though, Microsoft really did well with the new default API template. No useless references are added and almost no unnecessary code is included. So for APIs, I prefer to use the API template these days. Let's choose a name for our project. As we're going to create an API that will return information about cities, cityinfo.api sounds like a good name. We'll name the solution itself CityInfo. And I'm going to place this in my Pluralsight demo folder. Let's click Next. We leave everything else at the default settings. So we're targeting .NET 6. We don't include authentication at this time. We will include it later on in the course. We configure it for HTTPS. We won't use Docker. And we're going to use controllers, which means the MVC pattern, which we'll get into later. And we'll enable OpenAPI support, which takes care of documentation. Let's click Create. In the background, NuGet Restore is downloading the references used by the empty template. It seems to be done. Let's have a look. This is what we end up with. Consider this part of the demo a run-through of the basics, but don't worry if it feels like a lot to grasp at once. We'll revisit all of the concepts you'll hear about now multiple times throughout the course. At the end of the course, all of this will feel very familiar. Let's start by having a look at the project file itself. We can see that the target framework is set to .NET 6.0. That's the moniker for .NET 6. Only one package has been explicitly referenced, swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core. Swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core is an implementation of OpenAPI, or Swagger as it used to be called, for ASP.NET Core. Thanks to the fact that this is referenced and set up in the default ASP.NET Core API template, we will get a nice web UI that documents our API and allows for some testing out of the box. Once we start up the app, we'll see how it looks. For now, let's continue with inspecting this starter project. We notice that the project SDK is set to Microsoft.NET.SDK.Web. Projects that target the Microsoft.NET.SDK.Web SDK implicitly reference Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.App. We can see that if we drill down into the frameworks parent in the dependencies list. This is also called the ASP.NET Core Shared Framework. It contains assemblies that are developed and supported by Microsoft with the help of the open source community, and it's installed when the .NET SDK is installed on your machine. In essence, this includes the packages you need to support ASP.NET Core development. It includes packages that have to do with authentication, packages that have to do with hosting, packages that have to do with MVC, and so on. Likewise, Microsoft.NET Core.App contains assemblies by the .NET Core team that are required to run .NET apps. Examples are system.data, system.io, system.text.encoding, and so on. In other words, these are lower-level assemblies that make up the .NET developer platform. Underneath packages, we can find the explicitly referenced packages. In our case, that's just the one for generating documentation, swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core. And lastly, we have analyzers. These are packages that help analyze your code while developing. It's through these packages, which, by the way, you can also create yourself, that code analysis happens. And that's it as far as default references go. In regards to running the app, there's another file that's important. Underneath Properties, we can find launch-settings.json. This file is used to set up the environment for local machine development. It's thus only used on the local development machine, not deployed, and it contains profile settings, as we can see. There's two profiles here, one that's named after our project, cityinfo.api, and one that's named IIS Express. The first one has project as value for command name. That means it uses the Kestrel web server to launch the project. Kestrel is a built-in cross-platform web server. You'll see a console window pop up which acts as the host. The second profile, as the name implies, uses IIS Express as the web server. Personally, I prefer using Kestrel as, in my opinion, it's more in line with the cross-platform nature of .NET these days. We can choose the URL our app will run on here by setting the application URL. In my case, it looks like the app will run over HTTPS on port 7169 by default. Note that this port may very well be different on your machine. It's chosen by Visual Studio when creating the project. We can also set a launch URL. By default, that's set to /swagger, which means that the API documentation will be shown when launching the app. If you don't want to launch a browser at all, that's possible as well by setting launch browser to false. Personally, I prefer not to launch a browser by default all the time, so I'm going to effectively put this to false. Obviously, this is a purely personal preference. Feel free to change it to the value of your choice. We leave everything else as is for now. So let's save this. An alternative way of setting up how the application launches is via the project properties. For that, we right-click cityinfo.api and we navigate to Properties. We navigate to Debug, and then we choose to open the Debug Launch Profiles UI. It's here that we again find our two profiles, cityinfo.api and IIS Express. And here we can find likewise settings as we found in the launch-settings.json file. Editing this has an effect on the launch-settings.json file and vice versa. Before we look into the code, let's give this a try already. One way to launch the app is by pressing F5 or by clicking the play button. Note that you can select a profile that will be used for launching by pressing the downward-facing arrow. As mentioned, I prefer launching with Kestrel, so the profile I want to choose is the one with the project name, and that's already selected. F5 will launch the app with a debugger attached. If you want to start without attaching a debugger, you can press Ctrl F5 or click the slightly lighter play button. Let's launch the app. And there we go, that's it. We see a console window. But in that console window we see a message. Apparently the application has started. We also find the URL at which we can find our application. That's the HTTPS address here. Let's copy that and let's open a browser to navigate to it. If we navigate to the root, there's nothing to see yet. We get a 404 not found. That makes sense, we didn't put anything there yet. What we can do, however, is navigate to the Swagger endpoint. Swagger, as mentioned, enables a documentation UI for our API. It's included in the default template. So what we see here is Swagger at work. We also see that apparently we can already get a bunch of weather forecasts. That's because by default the API template includes this as sample code. To test, we can use the documentation page we're looking at. We choose Try it out, followed by Execute. And there we go, we get back a list of weather forecasts. Our first API call is a fact. Another way to rudimentary test an API is by simply navigating to it via your browser. In the documentation, we can read that the endpoint we're looking for is weather forecasts. So let's navigate to that. And there we go. With that, you know how to create and run a new ASP.NET Core project. But there's more than one way to create, build, and run a project. Let's check that out next.